Pastor Greg adopts a quiet black girl named Neela, who is unable to speak a word other than her name. But when she learns English, she reveals a startling truth that sends him rushing to call 911. What secret has Neela been hiding? And how will it change both of their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Pastor Greg walked down the quiet street. His heart was full from the inspiring sermon he had just delivered. The afternoon air was cool, and the wind blew on tree leaves on the sidewalk as he turned the corner. Something caught his eye. There, huddled against a brick wall, was a small figure. Pastor Greg's heart skipped a beat as he realized it was a little girl. She looked so tiny and fragile, her clothes dirty and torn. She shivered in the chilly night air. "Oh my goodness," Pastor Greg whispered, his voice filled with concern. He approached slowly, not wanting to scare her. "Hello there, little one. Are you okay?" The girl looked up, her big brown eyes wide with fear. She didn't say a word, she just stared at him. Pastor Greg knelt down his kind face, full of worry. "My name is Pastor Greg, can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated, then spoke in a tiny voice. Neela." Pastor Greg repeated softly, "That's a beautiful name. Are you cold? And where are your parents?" Neela didn't answer. She just hugged her knees tighter, looking lost and scared. Pastor Greg's heart broke for this poor child. He couldn't leave her here alone on the street. It wasn't safe, and she clearly needed help, Neela. He said gently, "Would you like to come with me? I can give you something warm to eat and a safe place to sleep tonight." Neela looked unsure, but the kindness in Pastor Greg's eyes seemed to comfort her a little. She nodded slowly. Pastor Greg smiled warmly. "That's good. Neela here. Let me help you up." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Neela took it. Her small hand felt ice cold in his warm grip as they walked together. Pastor Greg's mind raced. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And how could he help her? He didn't have all the answers, but he knew in his heart that God had put Neela in his path for a reason. "Don't worry, Neela," he said softly. "Everything's going to be all right." "Now I promise," as Pastor Greg and Neela entered his modest home. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the chilly evening air. The little girl's eyes darted around, taking in her new surroundings with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "This is my home," Neela, Pastor Greg said gently. "You're safe." Here he guided her to the kitchen, where he quickly prepared a simple meal of soup and bread. Neela's eyes widened at the sight of the food, but she hesitated to eat. "It's okay," Pastor Greg encouraged, miming eating with a spoon. "Go ahead." Slowly, Neela picked up the spoon and began to eat, Pastor Greg's heart aghast as he watched her devour the food, realizing how hungry she must have been after dinner. He showed her to the spare bedroom. "You can sleep here tonight," he explained, gesturing to the bed. Neela nodded silently. Her eyes were still wary as night fell. Pastor Greg sat in his living room, lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that finding Neela was more than just chance. It felt like divine intervention, a test of faith and compassion. "Lord," he whispered, "guide me, help me do right by this child." He thought about Neela's silence, wondering if she understood English or if there was another reason for her quietness. Either way, he knew he needed to find a way to communicate with her. Pastor Greg's mind raced with ideas. Maybe he could use pictures or simple gestures to start. He remembered some basic sign language from a workshop years ago. It wasn't much, but it was a start as he prepared for bed. Pastor Greg made a silent vow now he would protect Neela and help her find her voice. Whatever it took, something told him. This was just the beginning of a remarkable journey for both of them. The next morning, Pastor Greg woke up early, his mind still racing with thoughts of how to help Neela. He made a simple breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs, hoping the familiar smell would coax the little girl out of her room as he set the table. Enla peeked around the corner, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Good morning, Neela," Pastor Greg said softly, gesturing to the plate of food. "Breakfast." Neela nodded shyly and sat down at the table as they ate. Pastor Greg picked up the phone and dialed the local social services office. "This is Pastor Greg," he said when someone answered. "I need to speak with a social worker about a child I found last night," after explaining the situation. The social worker on the other end of the line agreed to look into Neela's case. "For now, she can stay with you, Pastor," the social worker said. "We'll be in touch." Soon, with that settled, Pastor Greg turned his attention back to Neela. He knew communication was key to helping her feel safe and understood. "Neela," he said, pointing to himself. "Greg." He repeated this a few times and then pointed to her. "Neela." The little girl's eyes lit up with recognition. She pointed to herself and whispered, "Neela." Encouraged by this small breakthrough, Pastor Greg began teaching her simple English words. He pointed to objects around the kitchen, saying each word clearly. "Table," he said, tapping the wooden surface chair plate. Spoon. Neela watched intently, her eyes following his gestures. After a few repetitions, she began to mimic the words softly as the days passed. Their routine continued each morning. Pastor Greg would introduce new words, and Neela would eagerly repeat them. Her vocabulary grew, and with it, her confidence. As the weeks passed, Pastor Greg's home became a place of learning and growth for Neela. Every day, he introduced new words and phrases, patiently helping her build her English skills. Neela's progress was slow but steady, and Pastor Greg's heart swelled with pride. Each time she mastered a new word. One Sunday morning, Pastor Greg decided it was time to introduce Neela to his church community. He gently explained to her that they would be going to some new church, he said, pointing to a picture of the building. "We'll go together." Neela nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and apprehension as they walked into the church. Pastor Greg felt her small hand grip his tightly. The congregation turned to look at them, and Neela shrank back, pressing herself against Pastor Greg's side. "It's okay," he whispered, patting her shoulder. "They're friends." One by one, members of the congregation approached them, offering warm smiles and gentle greetings. Pastor Greg introduced Neela to each person, explaining that she was a special girl he was caring for, though Neela remained quiet. Her eyes darted from face to face, taking in the kind expressions around her. Mrs. Johnson, a grandmotherly figure in the church, knelt down to Neela's level. "Welcome, sweetheart," she said softly, holding out a small stuffed animal. "This is for you." Neela hesitated, looking up at Pastor Greg for reassurance. He nodded encouragingly, and she reached out to accept the gift. A tiny smile tugged at her lips as the weeks went by. Church became a regular part of their routine. Each Sunday, Neela would sit beside Pastor Greg in the front. Pugh listened in intently to his sermons, even though she couldn't understand all the words. The congregation embraced her, showering her with affection and small gifts. Slowly but surely, Neela's walls began to crumble. Shy smiles became more frequent, and she started to respond to greetings with quiet hellos of her own. The warmth and kindness of the community were working their magic, helping Neela feel safe and accepted one quiet evening. Pastor Greg and Neela sat down for dinner at the small kitchen table. The aroma of warm chicken soup filled the air as Pastor Greg ladled the steaming liquid into bowls. Neela watched him intently, her eyes following his every move as they began to eat. Pastor Greg noticed Neela fidgeting with her spoon, her brow furrowed in concentration. He was about to ask if she needed help when suddenly she looked up at him with determination in her eyes. "I like soup," Neela said clearly, her voice soft but steady. Pastor Greg's spoon clattered against his bowl as he stared at her in amazement. His heart swelled with joy and pride. "Neela," he exclaimed, his eyes brimming with tears. "That's wonderful. You spoke a full sentence." Neela's face lit up with a shy smile. Encouraged by his reaction, "I like soup," she repeated this time with more confidence. Pastor Greg reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, Neela. You worked so hard." Emboldened by her success, Neela began to speak more. Her words came slowly at first, carefully. "Chosen and pronounced, streets cold," she said, her eyes growing distant. No food scared Pastor Greg's heart as he listened. He knew this moment was precious. Neela was finally opening up about her past. He leaned in, giving her his full attention as the days passed. Neela's confidence grew, along with her English skills. She began to share more about her life, opening up to Pastor Greg in small bursts. One rainy afternoon, they sat together in the cozy living room watching droplets race down the window pane. Neela's eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. Pastor Greg noticed her quietness and gently asked, "What's on your mind, Neela?" She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and longing. "I have a sister," she said softly, her voice trembling. Pastor Greg's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You have a sister?" he repeated, encouraging her to continue. Neela nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Twin sister Tala," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We were together on the streets." Pastor Greg felt his heart skip a beat. He leaned forward. His face was etched with concern about what happened to Hala. He asked gently. Neela's lower lip quivered as she spoke. "We got separated many months ago," she explained, struggling to find the right words. "I look for her, but can't find." Pastor Greg's mind reeling with this new information. Another child. Neela's twin was out there somewhere, possibly alone and scared. The thought made his chest tighten with worry. "Oh, Nia," he said softly, reaching out to hold her hand. "I'm so sorry. That must be so hard for you." Nia nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I miss Tala," she sobbed. She alone scared like me before Pastor Greg pulled Neela into a comforting hug, his own eyes misting over as he held the crying girl. His mind raced with thoughts of Tala. Where was she? She saves the realization that another child might be out there, vulnerable and in need of help. Hit him hard. Pastor Greg smiled through his own tears, deeply moved by her words. He knew there was still much more to uncover about Neela's past, but for now, this breakthrough was enough. They had taken a significant step forward, and he was grateful for the trust Neela had shown him. Pastor Greg held Neela close, his heart heavy with the weight of her revelation. As her sobs subsided, he gently pulled back to look into her eyes. "Nia," he said softly, "I promise you, we'll do everything we can to find Tala. You're not alone." In this anymore, Neela sniffled and nodded, a glimmer of hope shining through her tears. Pastor Greg gave her a reassuring smile and stood up, his mind already racing with plans. "I need to make a phone call," he explained, patting Neela's shoulder. "Why don't you draw a picture of Tala? It might help us find her." As Neela settled at the kitchen table with some paper and crayons, Pastor Greg retreated to his study. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number of Sarah, the social worker who had been helping with Neela's case. "Sarah, it's Pastor Greg," he said when she answered. "I have some important news about Neela. She has a twin sister named Tala, who's still out there on the streets." Sarah's sharp intake of breath echoed through the phone. "A twin? Oh my goodness, how long have they been separated?" "Months, according to N," Pastor Greg replied, his voice tight with worry. "We need to find her, Sarah. She's out there alone, probably scared and hungry." "I understand, Pastor," Sarah said, her tone serious. "I'll alert the authorities right away and start the search process. Can you get any more details from Neela? Anything that might help us locate?" Tala. Pastor Greg nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see him. "I'll do my best. Neela's drawing a picture of her right now. I'll send it to you as soon as it's done." After hanging up, Pastor Greg leaned against his desk, his mind whirling with concern for Tala. He closed his eyes and said a quick prayer, asking for guidance and protection for the lost child. Pastor Greg returned to the kitchen, his face a mix of determination and concern. He found Neela hunched over her drawing, her small hand gripping a crayon tightly. She looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "Neela," he said gently, "I'm going to call the police now. They can help us find Tala." Neela's eyes widened with fear. "Police?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Pastor Greg knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetie. The police are here to help. They're good people who want to bring Tala home safe." With a deep breath, Pastor Greg dialed 911 as the operator answered. He spoke clearly and calmly. "Hello, I need to report a missing child. Her name is Tala, and she's the twin sister of a girl. I'm currently caring for Neela watched intently. As Pastor Greg provided all the information he could, he described Tala based on Neela's appearance, explained their separation, and emphasized the urgency of the situation. The operator assured Pastor Greg that they would take the report seriously and send officers to his home immediately as he hung up. He noticed Neela's trembling hands. "It's okay to be scared," he said softly, pulling her into a hug. "But this is a good thing. The police will do everything they can to find." Tala. Neela buried her face in Pastor Greg's shoulder. Her voice muffled. "What if they don't find her?" Pastor Greg stroked her hair gently. "We have to have faith, Neela. We'll keep looking until we bring her home." I promise. A short while later, a knock at the door announced the arrival of 2 police officers. Pastor Greg invited them in, keeping a reassuring arm around Neela's shoulders. The officers spoke kindly to Neela, asking her questions about Tala and where they had last been together, though scared at first. Neela gradually opened up, encouraged by Pastor Greg's presence, as the officers prepared to leave. One of them knelt down to Neela's level. "We're going to do everything we can to find your sister," she said with a warm smile. "You've been very brave, Neela." After the police left, Pastor Greg found Neela standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the street outside. He joined her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "They're going to find her, aren't they?" Neela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Greg nodded, his voice filled with reassurance. "They'll do everything possible, Nyla. And so will we. We're not going to give up until Tala is safe and sound." As the days passed, Pastor threw himself into the search for Tala with unwavering determination. He worked closely with the police, providing every detail he could glean from Neela about her sister and their life on the streets. One morning, Pastor Greg sat at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers and a laptop. Neela peered over his shoulder, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Pastor Greg smiled warmly at her. "I'm making flyers with Tala's picture on them. We're going to put these up all over the city so people can help us look for her." Neela's face lit up with hope. "Really? Can I help?" "Of course, sweetie," Pastor Greg replied, handing her a stack of papers. "You can help me fold these as they work together." Pastor Greg's phone rang. It was Officer Martinez, the lead investigator on Tala's case. "We've got some leads, Pastor." The officer said, "We're following up on a few sightings in the downtown area." Pastor Greg's heart raced with excitement. "That's wonderful news. Thank you for the update." After hanging up, he turned to Neela, his eyes twinkling. "The police are working hard to find Tala. We need to keep praying and hoping that Sunday." Pastor Greg stood before his congregation, his voice filled with emotion as he shared Tala's story. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "I ask for your help and prayers. There's a little girl out there who needs our love and support at the church." Members listened intently, many wiping away tears as the service ended. People approached Pastor Greg, offering to help distribute flyers and spread the word. Mrs. Santos, a retired teacher, placed a gentle hand on Pastor Greg's arm. "We're with you, Pastor. That little girl will be found." The community's response was overwhelming. Volunteers fanned out across the city, plastering Tala's picture on street corners, in shop windows, and on community bulletin boards. Social media buzzed with shared posts and messages of hope as Pastor Greg watched his congregation mobilize. He felt a surge of gratitude and hope. He looked down at Neela, who stood quietly by his side. Her small hand clasped in his. "See, Neela," he said softly. "All these people are helping us look for Tala. We're not alone in this." Neela nodded, a small smile tugging at her lip for the first time. Since the search began, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would see her sister again, as the weeks dragged on with little news about Tala. Pastor Greg found himself struggling to maintain his optimism. Each day that passed without a lead felt like a heavy weight. On his shoulders, he tried to keep a brave face for Neela, but the worry lines on his forehead deepened with each passing day. Neela, too, was feeling the strain of the long wait. Her initial excitement had given way to a gnawing anxiety that seemed to grow with each sunset. She became quieter. Her eyes were often distant and filled with unshed tears. One evening, Pastor Greg tucked Neela into bed. He noticed her trembling lips and the fear in her eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked gently, sitting on the edge of her bed. Neela's voice was barely a whisper. What if we never find Tala?" Pastor Greg's heart ached at her words. He took a deep breath, fighting back his own doubts. "Neela," he said softly, "I know it's hard to wait, but we mustn't lose hope. God is watching over Tala, just as he's watching over us." Neela looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you know?" Pastor Greg smiled warmly. "Because I feel it in my heart. And you know what? We can talk to God right now and ask him for help. Would you like that?" Neela nodded, her small hand reaching out to grasp Pastor Greg's larger one. Pastor Greg bowed his head, and Naya followed suit. "Dear Lord," he began, his voice soft but steady, "we come to you tonight with heavy hearts. We ask for your strength to keep hoping, your wisdom to guide our search, and your love to comfort Tala, wherever she may be. Please help us find her and bring her home safely, amen." As they finished praying, Pastor Greg looked at Neela and saw a glimmer of peace in her eyes. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered in that moment. Pastor Greg felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that even in this difficult time, he was making a difference in Neela's life. She was learning to trust him and lean on him for support. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the quiet afternoon air, startling Pastor Greg from his thoughts. He hurried to answer it, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the police department's number on the caller ID. "Hello, Pastor Greg." "Speaking," he answered, his voice laced with anticipation. The officer on the other end spoke calmly, but his words sent a jolt of electricity through Pastor Greg's body. "Pastor, we may have found Tala, a girl matching. Her description was spotted at a homeless shelter." In the next city over, Pastor Greg's hand tightened on the receiver. His breath kept choking in his throat. "Are you sure? It's her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't confirm until we do a proper identification, but the similarities are striking," the officer replied. "We thought you should know right away," thanking the officer. Pastor Greg hung up the phone, his mind racing. He needed to tell Neela, but he didn't want to get her hopes up too high. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the living room where Neela was reading a book, Naya, Sweetheart. He said gently, sitting down next to her, "I just got a call from the police. They think they might have found Tala." Neela's eyes widened, the book slipping from her hands. "Really?" she gasped, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. Pastor Greg nodded, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "They're not completely sure yet, but there's a good chance. It might be her. She's at a shelter in another." Another tear welled up in Neela's eyes. A whirlwind of emotions played across her face. She looked excited, scared, and overwhelmed all at once. "Can we go see her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need to wait for the police to confirm. It's really her," Pastor Greg explained gently. "But if it is, we'll go as soon as we can, I promise." Neela nodded, and then suddenly threw her arms around Pastor Greg, burying her face. In his chest, he held her close, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Whether from joy or fear, he couldn't tell as he comforted. Neela, Pastor Greg sent up a silent prayer. "Please, Lord," he whispered, "let this be Tala. Let this family be whole again." The next morning, Pastor Greg and Neela set out for the homeless shelter with 2 police officers. The car ride was filled with nervous energy. Neela's small hand gripping Pastor Greg's tightly, he offered her reassuring smiles, but his own heart raced with anticipation as they pulled up to the shelter. Neela pressed her face against the window, her eyes scanning every face they passed. Pastor Greg gently guided her out of the car, his hand on her shoulder. "Remember, sweetie," he said softly, "we're not sure if it's really Tala. Try not to get too excited. Just yet." Neela nodded, but her eyes were wide with hope. They followed the officers into the building, the smell of cheap soap and old clothes filling their noses. A social worker LED'd them to a small room where a girl sat on a worn couch. Her dark hair was tangled and her clothes were dirty. As soon as Neela saw her, she let out a gasp. "Tala!" She cried, breaking free from Pastor Greg's grip and running towards her sister. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Neela!" she whispered, standing up just as Neela crashed into her arms. The sisters clung to each other, both sobbing uncontrollably. Pastor Greg watched tears filling his own eyes at the beautiful reunion. The police officers and social workers stepped back, giving the girls some privacy after a few moments. Tala looked up, her eyes landing on Pastor Greg. She tensed slightly, pulling Neela closer to her. Her gaze was wary, filled with questions and a hint of fear. "It's okay," Tala Neela said, wiping her eyes. "This is Pastor Greg. He's been taking care of me. He helped find you." Tala's eyes darted between Neela and Pastor Greg, uncertainty clear on her face. Pastor Greg smiled gently, keeping his distance to not overwhelm her. "Hello, Tala," he said softly. "I'm so glad we found you. You're safe now." Tala didn't respond, but she didn't pull away. When Neela tugged her towards Pastor Greg, the pastor could see the struggle. In her eyes, the joy of being reunited with her sister. Wearing with the caution learned from life on the streets, Pastor Greg took a deep breath and slowly approached the sisters. He knelt down to their level, his kind eyes meeting Tala's cautious gaze. He said gently, "I'm Pastor Greg. I've been taking care of Neela for a while now, and I'd like to help you too." Tala's grip tightened, but she didn't look away. Pastor Greg continued, his voice soft and reassuring. "I know you've been through a lot, and I can't imagine how scary it's been, but you're safe. Now, I've adopted Neela, and I want to offer you the same home. In care?" Neela squeezed her sister's hand. "It's true. Tala, Pastor Greg is really nice. He's given me food and a warm bed. He even taught me English." Tala's eyes darted between Neela and Pastor Greg, uncertainty clear on her face. She bit her lip, considering his words. "You want to help me too?" she asked, her voice barely above, a whisper. Pastor Greg nodded, his smile warm and genuine. "Yes, Tala. I want to give you both a safe home and a chance for a better life." Tala looked at Neela, who nodded encouragingly after a long moment. Tala took a deep breath and gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go with you." Relief washed over Pastor Greg's face. He stood up slowly, careful not to startle Tala. "That's wonderful, Tala. Let's go home, shall we?" As they walked out of the shelter, Tala clung tightly to Neela's hand. Pastor Greg led them to the car, opening the back door for the girls. They climbed in together. Tala pressed close to Nee's side. The ride back to Pastor Greg's house was quiet. Tala stared out the window, her eyes wide as she took in the passing scenery. Neela kept glancing at her sister, a mix of joy and concern on her face. Pastor Greg occasionally looked at them in the rearview mirror, his heart full of hope for their future. Together, the air in the car was thick with anticipation. Though no one spoke, there was a sense of possibility of a new chapter beginning as they drove. The first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, as if signaling a fresh start for the reunited sisters as they arrived at Pastor Greg's home. Tala hesitated at the doorstep. Her eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Pastor Greg gently ushered the girls inside, his voice soft and reassuring. "Welcome home, Tala," he said, smiling warmly. "This is your home now, too." Neela tugged on her sister's hand, excitement shining in her eyes. "Come on, Tala. I want to show you everything." Tala followed her sister. Her steps were cautious and unsure as they entered the living room. Her eyes widened at the sight of the cozy furniture and warm decor. It was a stark contrast to the harsh streets she had known for so long. Pastor Greg moved towards the kitchen. "I'll make us some hot chocolate. You girls make yourselves comfortable," as he busies himself in the kitchen. Neela led Tala to the couch. They sat down together, Tala still clinging tightly to her sister's hand. "It's okay," Tala Neela said softly. "Pastor Greg is really nice. He's been so kind to me." Neela squeezed her sister's hand. He's different, Tala. He found me on the street just like you were, but instead of ignoring me, he brought me. Here he gave me food and a warm bed." Tala listened intently as Neela continued. "Andy taught me English. Remember how we could barely understand anyone before? Now I can talk to people and you can learn." 2. Pastor Greg returned with 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He set them on the coffee table and took a seat in the armchair across from the girls, giving them space. "It's true," he said gently. "I want to help both of you. You're safe here, and you can stay as long as you need." Tala's eyes darted between Pastor Greg and the hot chocolate. Slowly she reached out and took a mug. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a small sip. Pastor Greg smiled, his eyes twinkling with kindness. "You're very welcome, Tala. I know it's a big change, but we'll take it one day at a time, okay?" Tala nodded, still uncertain but feeling a glimmer of hope as she sat there surrounded by warmth and the comforting presence of her sister. She allowed herself to relax just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something good. Pastor Greg wasted no time in starting the adoption process for Tala. He contacted the social worker who had helped with Neela's case, explaining the new situation. The social worker was amazed at the turn of events, but quickly got to work on the necessary paperwork. "It's going to take some time," the social worker warned Pastor Greg, "but we'll do our best to make this happen as smoothly as possible." Pastor Greg nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "I understand these girls deserve a stable home, and I'm committed to providing that for them while the legal process unfolds." Pastor Greg focused on helping Tala adjust to her new life. He started teaching her English just as he had done with Neela. Every day they would sit at the kitchen table surrounded by colorful picture books and flashcards. "Let's try this one, Tala," Pastor Greg said gently, holding up a card with a picture of a dog. "Can you say dog?" Tala furrowed her brow, concentrating hard. "Do." She struggled with the unfamiliar sounds, catching in her throat. Pastor Greg smiled encouragingly. "That's a great start. Let's try again." Dog Neela, sitting nearby, chimed in. "You can do it, Tala. Remember how hard it was for me at first, but Pastor Greg never gave up on me." Tala took a deep breath and tried again. "D-dog." She managed a small smile of triumph crossing. "Her face is wonderful." Pastor Greg beamed. "You're making progress already." As the days passed, Tala's English slowly improved. She struggled more than Neela had, often growing frustrated and retreating into silence. But Pastor Greg remained patient, always ready with a kind word or a gentle reminder. "It's okay to make mistakes," he would tell her. "That's how we learn and grow." One evening as they sat around the dinner table, Tala surprised them all. She pointed to her plate and said clearly, "More chicken, please." Pastor Greg and Neela exchanged shocked glances before breaking into wide smiles. Tala looked down, embarrassed, but pleased with herself, of course. Pastor Greg said, his voice filled with pride as he served her another piece. "You're doing so well, Tala. I'm very proud of you." As the days turned into weeks, Tala's walls began to creak and crumble one quiet evening as Pastor Greg sat reading in his favorite armchair. Tala approached him hesitantly. "Pastor Greg," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, smiling warmly. "Yes, Tala? What is it, Tala?" Tala fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, her eyes darting around the room. "Can I talk to you about something?" Pastor Greg set his book aside and patted the space next to him on the couch, of course. "Sweetheart, I'm always here to listen." Tala sat down, her small frame tense with unspoken words. Slowly, haltingly, she began to speak about her life on the streets. She told him about the cold nights huddled in doorways, the constant hunger that gnawed at her belly, and the fear that gripped her heart every time she heard footsteps approaching. Pastor Greg listened intently, his heart breaking with every word. He resisted the urge to interrupt, knowing how important it was for Tala to share her story. In her own time, "We tried to stay together." Tala said her voice was cracking, but one day there was a big crowd. Someone grabbed my arm, and when I turned around, Neela was gone. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find her. I was so scared. Pastor Greg gently placed his hand on To's shoulder. "You were so brave, Tala, and look at you. Now you're safe, and you're with your sister again." Tala nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for bringing me here." As the days passed, Tala shared more of her experiences. Sometimes she would open up during their English lessons. Other times she would seek out Pastor Greg specifically to talk each time. He listened with patience and compassion, offering words of comfort and encouragement. Neela, too, became more involved in these conversations. She would often hold her sister's hand as Tala spoke, or add her own memories to the stories. The shared experiences brought the sisters closer together, and Pastor Greg watched with joy as their bond strengthened one sunny afternoon as they sat in the backyard. Neela turned to Pastor Greg with a serious expression. "Pastor Greg," she said, "are you our dad?" Now the question caught him off guard, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the two girls, Neela with her hopeful eyes, and Tala trying to appear indifferent, but clearly hanging on his every word well. He said carefully, "I'm not your biological father, but if you'd like, I can be a father to you in every way that matters. I love you both very much, and I want to take care of you for as long as you need me." Tala, in a rare moment of vulnerability, reached out and took Pastor Greg's hand. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. The church hall buzzed with excitement as the congregation gathered for a special event. Colorful balloons and streamers adorned the walls, and a large banner hung at the front reading "Welcome Home." Tala Pastor Greg stood at the entrance, his hand resting gently on Tala's shoulder as they walked in together. Tala's eyes widened as she took in the scene. She had never seen so many smiling faces in one place before. The warmth in the room was palpable, and for a moment, she felt overwhelmed. "It's okay," Pastor Greg whispered, sensing her hesitation. "These are all friends. They're here for you." As they moved further into the room, people began to approach them. Mrs. Johnson, a kindly older woman, stepped forward. "Ward first welcomed Tala," she said, her eyes twinkling. "We've been so excited to meet you." Tala managed a shy smile, clinging close to Pastor Greg. Neela appeared at her side, taking her hand. "It's okay, Tala. They're all really nice." One by one, members of the congregation came to greet Tala. They offered warm words, gentle hugs, and small gifts. A young boy about Tala's age presented her with a handmade card decorated with glitter and stickers as the evening progressed. Tala began to relax. She found herself laughing at jokes, enjoying the delicious food, and even participating in some of the games organized for the children. The love and acceptance she felt from everyone was unlike anything she had experienced before. At one point, Pastor Greg stood up to address the gathering. Today he began, his voice filled with emotion. "We celebrate not just Tala's arrival, but the power of community and love. Tala and Neela have taught us all about resilience and hope, and in return, we open our hearts and our church family to them." Tala felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly safe and wanted. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who just hours ago had been strangers. Now they felt like family as the celebration wound down. Tala tugged on Pastor Greg's sleeve when he bent down. She whispered thank you for everything as the weeks passed. Neela's confidence grew along with her English skills. She blossomed like a flower in spring, her shy demeanor giving way to a more outgoing personality. At school, she began to raise her hand more often, answering questions with a newfound assurance. One day during recess, a classmate named Emily approached Neela. "Hey, want to play jump rope with us?" she asked, smiling warmly. Neela's face lit up. "Yes, I'd love to," she replied with her words clear and well-pronounced as Neela skipped and laughed with her new friends. Her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, watched from afar, marveling at the transformation. She made a mental note to share Neela's progress with Pastor Greg at their next parent-teacher meeting at church. Neela's involvement deepened. She joined the children's choir, her sweet voice blending harmoniously with the others during Sunday services. She also volunteered to help with the weekly food drive, eagerly sorting donations and packing boxes for those in need. Pastor Greg beamed with pride as he watched Neela flourish. Her journey from a scared, silent child to this confident young girl was nothing short of miraculous back at home. Tala observed her sister's progress with a mix of admiration and determination. She saw how Neela's improved English opened doors to new friendships and opportunities. Inspired, Tala threw herself into her language lessons with renewed vigor. Pastor Greg Tala called out one evening, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pored over an English workbook. "Can you help me with this sentence?" Pastor Greg sat down beside her, patiently explaining the grammar rule. Tala listened intently, her eyes bright with determination. "I want to be able to talk to people like Neela does." "She confessed you will," Tala Pastor Greg assured her, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're making great progress already." Pastor Greg sat in his favorite armchair, a worn Bible resting on his lap. The house was quiet with Neela and Tala fast asleep upstairs as he gazed at the family photos adorning the walls. His heart swelled with love and gratitude. He thought back to that fateful night when he found Neela huddled on the street corner. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, looking at the smiling faces in the photos. He could hardly believe the transformation that had taken place. Neela, once so timid and withdrawn, had blossomed into a confident young girl. Her laughter now filled the house, and her kindness touched everyone she met. Taylor. Initially wary and guarded, she had slowly opened her heart to trust and love again. Pastor Greg's eyes misted over as he remembered their first Christmas together. The girls' faces had lit up with wonder at the twinkling lights and colorful ornaments. It was a moment of pure joy that he would cherish forever. He realized that adopting Neela and Tala hadn't just changed their lives. It had transformed his own in ways. He never expected the loneliness that had once gnawed. His heart was gone, replaced by a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment. Lord Pastor Greg whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "Thank you for bringing these precious girls into my life. They are truly the greatest blessing I could have ever asked for." As he sat there surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, Pastor Greg felt a renewed determination. He wanted to do everything in his power to help Neela and Tala reach their full potential. Their journey was far from over, and he was committed to guiding them every step of the way he thought about. Neela's growing interest in teaching and Tala's curiosity about medicine made Pastor Greg make a mental note to look into programs and opportunities that could nurture these budding passions. With a contented sigh, Pastor Greg closed his Bible and stood up as he climbed the stairs to check on the girls one last time before bed. His heart was full of love, hope, and anticipation for the future they would build together as the warm morning sun filtered through the kitchen window. Pastor Greg sat at the table sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. Neela was already at school, but Tala, still catching up on her studies, was home for the day. Tala padded into the kitchen. Her hair was slightly mussed from sleep. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Good morning, Pastor Greg," she said carefully, her words. Clear and confident, Pastor Greg looked up, his eyes widening in surprise and delight. "Good morning, Tala," he replied, setting down his paper. "How did you sleep?" Tala's face lit up with a shy smile. "I slept well, thank you," she answered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I had a nice dream about a big green park." Pastor Greg's heart swelled with pride. This was the first time Tala had spoken to him in full sentences without stumbling or searching for words. He gestured for her to sit down, barely able to contain his excitement. "That sounds like a lovely dream," he said gently, encouraging her to continue. "Would you like to tell me more about it?" Tala nodded eagerly, pulling out a chair in my dream. "Neela and I were playing on swings," she explained, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "You were there too, pushing us higher and higher." We were all laughing as Tala continued to describe her. Dream Pastor Greg listened intently, marveling at how far she had come. Her words flowed more smoothly now, her confidence growing with each sentence. When she finished, Pastor Greg reached out and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Tala, I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard, and it shows. This is a big moment." Tala's eyes shimmered with unshed tears of joy. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Absolutely. Pastor Greg affirmed we should celebrate this achievement. How about we surprise Neela with a special dinner tonight?" Tala's face broke into a wide grin. "Yes, please," she exclaimed. "Can we make her favorite, lasagna?" Pastor Greg chuckled warmly. "That's a wonderful idea. We'll go shopping for ingredients this afternoon as they begin planning the celebratory dinner." Tala felt a warmth spreading through her chest for the first time since coming to live with Pastor Greg. She truly felt like she belonged. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted her for so long began to fade, replaced by hope for the future. Moments later, Pastor Greg sat with Neela and Tala at the kitchen table. Their homework spread out before them. He watched with pride as the girls worked through their math problems. Their brows furrowed in concentration. "You know," he said softly, "I'm so impressed by how hard you both work. You can achieve anything you set your minds to." Neela looked up, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Really, Pastor Greg? Anything?" He nodded, smiling warmly. "Absolutely. God has given you both incredible gifts. What are your dreams? What do you want to be when you grow up?" The girls fell silent for a moment, deep in thought. Neela was the first to speak up, her voice soft but sure. "I think I'd like to be a teacher someday." Pastor Greg's heart swelled with pride. "That's wonderful. Neela, you would make an excellent teacher. Why does that interest you?" Neela's cheeks flushed slightly as well. "I remember how scared I was when I couldn't understand English. I want to help other kids like me, so they don't feel lost and alone." Tala listened to her sister, a thoughtful expression on her face. Pastor Greg turned to her. "What about you, Tala? Have you thought about what you'd like to do?" Tala hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I want to be a doctor." Pastor Greg's eyebrows raised in surprise. "A doctor? That's a wonderful goal, Tala. What made you choose that?" Tala's eyes grew distant, remembering her time on the streets. "When I was alone, I saw so many people who were sick or hurt. They had no one to help them. I want to be the one who helps, who makes people feel better." Pastor Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, gently squeezing both girls' hands. "Those are beautiful dreams, both of you, and I believe with all my heart that you can achieve them." He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes shining with determination. "It won't always be easy. You'll have to study hard and work even harder. But I promise you, I'll be here every step of the way to support you. We'll find a way to make your dreams come true." The years passed like leaves falling from trees, each season bringing new growth and change for Neela and Tala. Under Pastor Greg's loving care, the girls blossomed from their early hardships, fading into distant memories. Neela, once shy and withdrawn, now walks the school halls with quiet confidence. Her gentle nature drew others to her, and she found herself surrounded by friends. But it was in her studies that Neela truly shone. She poured herself into her books, soaking up knowledge like a sponge one day. As Neela sat in her English class, her teacher announced a special project. "We'll be tutoring younger students who are struggling with reading." Mrs. Johnson explained. Neela's heart leapt with excitement. This was her chance to help others like herself when she got home that afternoon. Neela burst through the door, her eyes shining. "Pastor Greg, I'm going to be a tutor," she exclaimed. Pastor Greg's face lit up with pride. "That's wonderful, Neela. You'll be perfect for that." As the weeks went by, Neela threw herself into tutoring. She worked patiently with a young boy named Miguel, who reminded her so much of herself when she first arrived. Slowly but surely, Miguel's reading improved, and Neela felt a warmth in her heart that she'd never experienced before. Meanwhile, Tala was carving her own path. Her natural curiosity blossomed into a passion for science in biology class. She was always the first to raise her hand, eager to learn more about the human body and how it worked one afternoon. Tala's science teacher pulled her aside after class. "Tala, I've noticed your enthusiasm for biology. Have you ever considered joining our school's science club?" Tala's eyes lit up. "Really? You think I could?" The teacher nodded, smiling. "Absolutely. In fact, we're working on a project to create care packages for homeless shelters. I think you'd be a great addition to the team that evening." Tala couldn't stop talking about the science club as she helped Pastor Greg prepare dinner. "And we'll be putting together first aid kits and hygiene supplies," she explained excitedly. "It's a way to use science to help people, just like I want to do as a doctor someday." Pastor Greg listened, his heart swelling with pride. He watched as Neela and Tala set the table, chattering about their day. These two girls, once lost and alone, were now thriving, using their experiences to help others. He silently thanked God for bringing them into his life and for the incredible journey they were on together, as the warm June sun shone down on the high school's football field. Neela stood among her classmates, her graduation gown fluttering in the gentle breeze. Her heart swelled with pride and gratitude as she heard her name called, followed by the words "with honors." She walked across the stage, her eyes searching the crowd until they met Pastor Greg's beaming face. Tala cheered loudly from her seat, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her sister accept her diploma. The journey that had brought them here seemed almost unreal, a testament to their resilience and the love of the man who had become their father. After the ceremony, Pastor Greg enveloped both girls in a warm embrace. "I'm so proud of you, Neela," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far." Neela smiled, her eyes shining. "I couldn't have done it without you, Pastor Greg. You believed in me when no one else did as they celebrated that evening." Neela shared her plans for the future. "I've decided to study education at the local university," she announced. "I want to become a teacher and help children who struggle like I did." Pastor Greg nodded, a knowing smile on his face. He had watched. Neela's passion for teaching grew over the years, from tutoring to volunteering at the church's Sunday school. "You found your calling," and he said softly, "You'll be an amazing teacher." Tala, who was finishing her junior year, listened intently to her sister's plans. Her own path was equally clear in her mind. "I'm going to start preparing for medical school," she declared. "I've been researching pre-med programs, and I think I found a few that would be perfect." Pastor Greg looked at both girls, his heart filled with pride. These two young women, once lost and alone, were now on the brink of bright futures. Neela, with her gentle spirit and patience, would touch the lives of countless children. Tala, with her sharp mind and determination, was well on her way to becoming the doctor she had always dreamed of being. As they sat around the dinner table sharing memories and dreams, Pastor Greg silently thanked God for the privilege of being part of their journey. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Neela and Tala would face them with the same strength and resilience that had brought them this far. Years go on, and summer faded into fall. Neela began her journey as a teacher at Riverside Elementary School. Her classroom was a warm and inviting space filled with colorful posters and encouraging messages. Neela's gentle nature and patience shone through as she worked with her young students, many of whom faced challenges similar to those she had once experienced outside of her regular teaching duties. Neela felt a calling to do more. She approached Pastor Greg with an idea that had been growing in her heart. "I want to start a program for homeless children," she explained, her eyes bright with determination. "To teach them basic skills and give them hope." Pastor Greg listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. He saw in Neela the same compassion that had led him to take her in all those years ago. "That's a wonderful idea," and he said, his voice filled with emotion. "How can I help?" Together they worked to set up an after-school program at the church. Neela volunteered her time teaching reading, writing, and math to children who had fallen through the cracks of the education system. She understood their struggles intimately, and her empathy created a safe space for them to learn and grow. One evening, as Pastor Greg observed Neela working with a group of children, he felt overwhelmed by the journey they had taken. He watched as she knelt beside a young girl, gently guiding her hand as she formed letters on the page. The child's face lit up with a proud smile, and Neela beamed back at her. "You're doing great." Neela encouraged softly, "Keep practicing, and soon you'll be writing your own stories." Pastor Greg's eyes welled with tears as he witnessed the impact. Neela's decision to give back to the community in such a meaningful way touched him deeply. He saw how her own experiences had shaped her into a compassionate and dedicated teacher, determined to offer others the same chance she had been given. As the children filed out, at the end of the session, Neela approached Pastor Greg, her face glowing with happiness. "Thank you for supporting this program," she said, hugging him tightly. "It means so much to be able to help these kids." Pastor Greg hugged her back, his voice thick with emotion. "Neela, you're the one doing all the hard work. I'm just so proud of the woman you've become and the difference you're making in these children's lives." As autumn leaves painted the streets in vibrant hues, Tala nervously checked her mailbox every day. Her dream of becoming a doctor hung in the balance, waiting for that one crucial letter. On a crisp October morning, her hands trembled as she opened an envelope bearing the seal of her top-choice medical school. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the words, "We are pleased to offer you admission." Tala's heart soared with joy and disbelief. She rushed inside, her voice cracking with emotion as she called out, "Pastor Greg, Neela, I got in." And Pastor Greg and Neela came running, their faces lighting up with excitement. Tala held out the letter, her hands shaking. "I'm going to be a doctor," she whispered, still in awe of the words. Pastor Greg enveloped her in a warm hug, his eyes glistening with pride. "Oh, Tala," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard. For this, I always knew you could do it." Neela joined the embrace, wrapping her arms around her sister and the man who had become their father. "I'm so proud of you, Tala," she said, wiping away happy tears that evening. They celebrated Tala's accomplishment with a special dinner as they sat around the table. Tala looked at the faces of her family, overwhelmed by the love and support that had brought her to this moment. "I can't believe this is real," Tala said softly, her eyes. "Misty went from living on the streets to becoming a doctor. It feels like a miracle." Pastor Greg reached out and squeezed her hand. "You made this happen, Tala. Your determination and hard work got you here." Tala shook her head, her voice filled with gratitude. "But I couldn't have done it without you, Pastor Greg. Your support and your belief in me. It changed everything as the years passed." Neela's passion for teaching and helping others only grew stronger. Her classroom became a haven for children from all walks of life, but she felt a special connection to those who struggled the most. One chilly afternoon, Neela stayed late at school preparing for her after-school tutoring program. As she arranged the desks, her mind wandered to her own past. She remembered the fear and loneliness of life on the streets, and how Pastor Greg's kindness had changed everything. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called out with a warm smile. A small boy named Tommy peeked in, his clothes worn and his eyes uncertain. Neela's heart went out to him, recognizing the look of a child who had seen true hardship. Tommy," she said gently, "ready for some math?" Tommy nodded shyly and took a seat as Neela began the lesson. She noticed how quickly he caught on, despite his lack of regular schooling. His eagerness to learn reminded her of herself and Tala when they first started their new life with Pastor Greg. After the tutoring session, Neela knelt beside Tommy. "You did great today," she said, her voice full of encouragement. "How would you like to join our weekend reading program?" Tommy's eyes lit up. "Really, you mean it?" Neela nodded, her heart swelling with joy at his excitement. "Of course, we'd love to have you." As Tommy left, Neela felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew that every child she helped was a chance to pass on the love and support she had received. Her work wasn't just a job. It was a calling. Later that evening, as Neela prepared materials for her next day's lessons, she reflected on how far she had come from a scared little girl on the streets to a teacher making a difference in children's lives. Her journey had been remarkable, and through it, all Pastor Greg's unwavering support had been her guiding light as Tala stepped into the small, bustling clinic in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. She felt a sense of purpose wash over her. The years of hard work and study had led her to this moment, and she was ready to make a difference. The waiting room was packed with patients, their faces etched with worry and weariness. Tala's heart ached for them, remembering all too well the feeling of helplessness that came with life on the streets. "Dr. Tala, we have a young boy with a high fever in exam room 2. A nurse called out, snapping Tala back to the present. She nodded and made her way to the room, her white coat a stark contrast to the worn walls of the clinic. Inside, she found a mother cradling her son, fear evident in her eyes. "Hello, I'm Dr. Tala," she said softly, kneeling down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "Buddy Marcus." The boy whispered, his voice weak, as Tala examined Marcus. Her mind flashed back to the times she and Neela had been sick on the streets, with no one to turn to for help. The memory strengthened her resolve to provide the best care possible. After treating Marcus and reassuring his mother, Tala moved on to her next patient. The day flew by in a blur of examinations, diagnoses, and treatment. Despite the long hours and challenging cases, Tala felt energized by the work during a rare, quiet moment. Tala pulled out her phone and saw a text from Neela Hope. "Your day is going well, sis. Remember, you're changing lives." Tala smiled, feeling a rush of warmth no matter how busy their lives got. She and Annie always made time to check in on each other. Their bond, forged through hardship and strengthened by love, remained unbreakable as she replied to Neela's message. Tala reflected on their journey from scared little girls on the streets to successful professionals making a difference in their community. They had come so far, and through it all they had each other and the unwavering support of Pastor Greg. Pastor Greg sat in his favorite armchair, a well-worn Bible resting on his lap. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the photos adorning his living room walls. His eyes lingered on a picture of Neela and Tala at their high school graduation. Their smiles radiant and full of promise, a gentle smile crossed his face as he remembered that day. It seemed like only yesterday. He had found Neela huddled on that street corner, scared and alone. Now both girls had grown into remarkable women, each making a difference in their own way. Lord Pastor Greg whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for guiding me to those precious girls. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of their journey." He reached for his phone, scrolling through recent messages from Neela and Tala. Neela had sent a photo of her classroom decorated with colorful posters and inspirational quotes. Tala had shared a story about a young patient she had helped, her words brimming with compassion and dedication. Master Greg's heart swelled with pride. He had always known the girls were destined for greatness, but seeing their dreams come to fruition was beyond anything he could have imagined. As he sat there lost in thought, the doorbell rang. Pastor Greg slowly rose to his feet, his joints creaking a bit more than they used to. He opened the door to find Mrs. Thompson, a longtime member of his congregation, holding a casserole dish. "Pastor Greg," she said warmly, "the church group wanted to make sure you had a good meal tonight. We know how busy you've been with the new youth program." He accepted the dish, gratefully touched by the continued support of his community. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Please tell everyone I appreciate their kindness." As Mrs. Thompson left, Pastor Greg felt a renewed sense of gratitude wash over him. The church had been there every step of the way, embracing Neela and Tala as their own, offering prayers and support through every triumph and challenge weeks. Later, the community center buzzed with excitement as people filed into the auditorium. Pastor Greg sat in the front row, his heart swelling with pride. Today was a special day. Neela and Tala were giving a joint speech about their incredible journey. As the twins took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Neela, dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, stepped up to the microphone. "First, good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady and warm. "My sister, Tala, and I are here to share our story with you. It's a story of hope, faith, and the power of love." Tala joined her sister at the microphone, her eyes scanning the audience until they met Pastor Greg's. She smiled softly before speaking. "We were once two scared little girls on the streets," Tala said, her voice filled with emotion, "lost alone and without hope, but then a miracle happened." Neela continued, "Pastor Greg found me one cold night. He took me in, cared for me, and taught me that I mattered, but my heart was still broken because I had lost my sister." The audience listened intently as the twins took turns recounting their journey, from their reunion to their struggles learning English, and finally to their triumphs in education and careers. "Our story isn't just about us," Tala said, her voice strong and clear. It's about the power of faith and community. It's about how one person's kindness can change lives forever. Neela nodded in agreement. Pastor Greg showed us what it means to have faith not just in God but in ourselves and in each other. He taught us that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and commitment. As they spoke, many in the audience wiped away tears. Pastor Greg felt his own eyes welling up, overwhelmed by the strength and grace of the young women before him. Today, we stand before you not as victims, but as survivors. Tala said, "We're here to tell you that no matter how dark things may seem, there's always hope." Neela concluded their speech with a powerful message. "We encourage each of you to look around and see how you can make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is opening your heart to someone in need." As the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse. First, Pastor Greg made his way to the stage. Neela and Tala rushed to meet him, their faces glowing with joy and pride. The three of them embraced a tangle of arms and happy tears. "Thank you, girls, you're both a blessing," Pastor Greg said softly, his voice thick with emotion. They walked together arm in arm to Pastor Greg's modest house, the same house that had become a sanctuary for two lost little girls. So many years ago, as they entered, memories of their shared journey flooded back in the cozy living room. They settled onto the old, comfortable couch. Neela and Tala sat on either side of Pastor Greg, just as they had done countless times. Before Pastor Greg, Neela began, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We can't thank you enough for everything you've done for us." Tala nodded in agreement. "You saved our lives." She added, her voice barely above a whisper. "You gave us a future we never thought possible." Pastor Greg looked at each of them, his heart overflowing with love. "Oh, my girls," he said, his voice trembling. "You have no idea what a blessing you've been to me." Neela reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You showed us what love really means," she said. "You taught us about faith, not just in God, but in ourselves and in each other. And you gave us a family," Tala added, leaning her head on Pastor Greg's shoulder. "A real family filled with love and support." Pastor Greg felt tears rolling down his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. "You too," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are my greatest blessing. You've brought so much joy and purpose to my life." The three of them sat there wrapped in a warm embrace, their hearts full of gratitude and love. They knew without a doubt that their bond would last a lifetime. "I pour my heart into bringing you these heartwarming stories every day. If you'd like to support my work, you can tap the Super Thanks button below. Your kindness means the world to me. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of this community. And if you enjoyed the story of Pastor Greg, Neela, and Tala, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it."